Okay, this is Emergence of the U.S. as a World Power Part 3. Where we left off last time, we were looking at economic forces that drove Europe. Economic forces arising out of the Industrial Revolution that drove Europe to a second era of imperialism in the late 19th century down to about the middle of the 20th century. And it would have gone on further if World War II had not practically impoverished most of the imperial powers. Okay. The next thing after search for raw materials or controllable sources of raw materials from which you could exclude your rivals. That's one reason for taking over. Here's another: captive markets. Okay. As I was saying when the last video quit, um, they're industrialized countries. They're producing consumer goods at high levels, and it's new, and maybe figuring out what volume to produce so that you don't overproduce the market. Maybe they don't get that nailed right away. So the fear was that you would overproduce. Now the problem here is that you got all these industrialized countries packed in together like sardines on Western Europe, and each one's trying to be as self-sufficient as it can be. Okay, they really don't want to buy manufactured goods from each other. They want their people buying them from their own manufacturers, not somebody else's manufacturers. So, but what if you overproduce? Your neighbors aren't going to buy that stuff. I should point out here that part of the imperialism thing would be trying to find other markets in the world that you can take over and control, where you can dump off your surpluses. Why is that important? That's a matter of national security. Here's the problem: if you overproduce, you could have what would later be called a depression. The 19th century, they called them gluts, G-L-U-T, a glut. You've overproduced, the goods aren't moving, maybe prices fall, that would help some, but factories lay off employees or they close, unemployment rises, and these aren't rural peasants who can still raise carrots and eat them and not starve. These are city-dwelling factory workers, and if they can't work, they can't make money, they can't eat, they could be looking starvation in the face. And before they'll do that, the fear was, and this is real close, it's not a made-up story, they would become politically radicalized. They would take to the streets and man the barricades and attempt to overthrow the entire economic system and the government with it. So you cannot take that risk. You cannot risk letting that happen. So it seemed a matter of national security to secure foreign markets that you could place under your control and exclude your competitors and make them buy just from you. So that's another force that's pushing them. And we're not paying attention to this. There's something else about the Europeans I'll come back to. We really weren't paying attention to that much until it was almost too late. You know what? I'm going to come back to that when we're just talking about how we fit into the picture. One third thing has to do with capital. It can be investable money. It can be anything. It's the goods that are used to produce goods and services. Okay? But we're talking here about investment capital. Britain especially was so successful, they created a whole class of outrageously wealthy people who are looking for profitable venues in which to invest their profits. England, or should I say the United Kingdom, has a capital glut. When there's a surplus of something, prices will go down. The price of investment capital is return on investment. It's interest rates. Interest rates are in the pits in England because there's just too much money there. So, 3% a year, you'd be turning cartwheels. So, some English investors were interested in more risky but potentially much more rewarding investment venues abroad, around the world. And In parts of the world like Africa, where it's simply too easy, the government didn't mind just going in and claiming whole countries, whole areas, um, so that investors could invest there. So you had diamond mines in South Africa, you had railroads in Africa, you had railroads in South America, although they did not extend control there. There were cattle ranches in Wyoming owned by British investors. So you don't always have to take over, but it just reduces the risk when you can. Okay? There was an extremely wealthy Englishman. He probably would have pronounced his name Cecil. We might call it Cecil Rhodes. He endowed the so-called Rhodes Scholarship, and there was a country for a while in South Africa named for him, Rhodesia. They've changed it to Zimbabwe. But he had a diamond mine in South Africa. Wanted to build a railroad from Cape Town, South Africa to Cairo, Egypt. And the British government accommodatingly moved in and just simply took over most of the parts of Africa along the route. And then the German government, and kind of keep this in mind, Germany had not been politically united in many centuries until 1871. They're newly united, they're fanatically nationalistic, and they have come late to the party. And in a kind of geopolitical tic-tac-toe move, the Germans moved in and grabbed off some land that so the Cape Town to Cairo Railroad was, as far as I know, not ever completed unless they made a deal where they could run it through a German-held part of Africa. So that's what's driving Europe for imperialism, that they have to have raw materials. It's simply too easy to go take over the places that have them, and then you can exclude your competitors. You can also sell off your surplus manufactured goods there and avoid gluts, and it's safer for your investors to invest there. There you go. Now, how were these same forces affecting the U.S.? They were, but not anywhere near so much. Until the late 1800s, the United States primarily exported raw materials. As long as we are primarily an exporter of raw materials, then we are not in competition with the European industrialized countries. We're buying manufactured goods from them. That's great. We're selling them raw materials. But year by year, this imbalance is being redressed. And finally, about 1890, it's about even. We're trying to market about the same value of manufactured goods as we were raw materials. As the 1890s went on by, manufactured goods outpaced raw materials in our exports, and that put us into competition with European powers to find markets abroad for our manufactured goods. What are we selling? We had a niche. We weren't the only country with companies that made sewing machines, but we dominated the international sewing machine market. Okay, they're already gobbling up much of the planet, and we wouldn't have been inclined to gobble up the planet. We were not imperialist by nature, but Africa's gone. China, the Chinese ports have largely been taken over. We're being frozen out. So, like it or lump it, if this is how the game's going to be played, we don't set the rules, but we have to be involved. So the same forces that pushed the Europeans were, to a lesser extent, pushing the United States. Okay, now what's in our heads when we stick our toe in the water of the murky water of imperialism? I never did really like the way I have the questions set up on your class notes worksheet. The next one up is, what role did other forces, and these are habits of thought, these are assumptions, what role did they play? I want to lay a big word on you. You probably will not want to impress your friends with it. Ethnocentricity. It should appear on the screen there. You know what an ethnicity is? An ethnic group. Okay, that would be if you're French, that's an ethnicity. If you're German, that's an ethnicity. If you're Japanese, that's a racial ethnicity, okay? You're ethnocentric if you assume that the cultures and manners of your particular distinct ethnicity are normative. It's not the same as normal. Normal is descriptive. That's it's consistent with what most people do. That's normal. Something is normative if it's prescriptive, if it becomes, as far as you're concerned, the standard by which normal is measured. Okay, so West Europeans tended to be ethnocentric. So did we, even though we have never had a particularly sharply defined American ethnicity. We're too polyglot for that. So if you assume that your ways are right and just and superior, you can, with a clear conscience, assume, it's a false clear conscience, but it's clear, that practically gives you a mandate, a responsibility to teach lesser peoples who don't follow the same ways you do how to do things right. So that passes uncriticized. The other thing, let's see, ethnocentricity and the missionary impulse. Most people would think in terms of religious missionaries, and there were a lot of them, primarily from Britain and the United States. Mainline Protestant groups sent missionaries, many of them to Africa. Result being that Christianity is the number one religion in Africa in terms of number of adherents. I think it still is, adherents. To China, Korea, places like that. Scottish Presbyterians, and Presbyterianism is associated with Scotland, their missionaries in Korea were so successful that today South Korea has more Presbyterians than Scotland does. China may have more Christians than the United States does, and those are some tough people because the government wants to stamp out all active religious organizations that it does not control in that benighted country. Now, there's a religious missionary impulse, and there were religious leaders had considerable political clout in those days because they might have, denomination church members in the hundreds of thousands who are going to follow political recommendations and vote together as a block. They largely did, whatever denomination it was. But they would, with no other reason, no economic or any other reason to support imperialism, they might tend to support it because having a friendly government extend control over some part of Africa or other, or maybe an Asian seaport, that would open doors for the missionaries and just make it less likely that they would encounter hardships there. It was called the imperialism of righteousness. Okay? I think, and I don't know if anybody else has said this, it may just be me, but I'll stand by it. I think there was a political missionary impulse. The assumption went unchallenged that the highest form of government ever invented by man was the constitutional republic. It was democratically controlled. And that was the highest form of government. That was the apex of governmental evolution. And that gave countries like we, and to some extent the Brits, who had constitutional republics, a duty, a responsibility to spread the virtues of that form of government around the world. It was political, not religious, but it kind of worked the same way. And I would suggest, before you giggle at that people around the world, if there were any way to take a poll on it, if they could have any kind of government they wanted, they would prefer to have a constitutional republic in their countries. It's just not that easy to do, and we should not take it for granted and think it will always be here when there are so many people in our midst who would love to do away with it. Okay, we're going to let this go and come back with more of this here in a minute.